For more is Constance Baroudos, a policy analyst and program director at the Washington policy firm, the Lexington Institute. And in Athens, James Galbraith is a professor at the University of Texas. And Nicholas Larigakis joins us here in the studio. He's President and Chief Operating Officer of the American Hellenic Institute. Thanks all of you for joining us. James, you're in Athens. What a last 24, 36 hours, a decisive no vote. What's the feeling on the streets of Athens?
Well, it was indeed a landslide. It was a 60%, 61% vote. The no carried every single constituency in Greece. And there was a considerable outpouring last night on Syntagma Square, a celebration. This marked, I think, an act of considerable political courage by the Greek people to face down what had been a week-long campaign of intimidation, of squeezing of their access to cash through the ATMs and the banking system, and enormous pressure on them to vote for the yes vote. And effectively, they said, we cannot be so easily intimidated. The mood was not so much ebullient as, I think, calm and determined, and it really was, I think, a very impressive thing to see.
Is there a sense among the Greek people that this vote can actually change things in Berlin and Brussels and beyond?
I think it had a shock effect on the capitals of North Europe, yes. They were expecting a yes vote. They were expecting the campaign, certainly a week ago, they were expecting that the campaign of intimidation would work. It clearly didn't. I think this has to cause them to think twice about the policies that they've been pursuing. And in particular, it needs to cause the European Central Bank to think twice about the policy of strangling the Greek banking system, which is an extremely strange and inappropriate thing for a central bank to be doing. Financial stabilization is the function of a central bank. What we've seen here over the last week is a massive case of attempted financial destabilization. Very strange, very inappropriate, very political, frankly.
Nick Larigakis, I want to bring you in here. Do you agree with that sentiment? Because nothing has changed, according to the European and global creditors, when it comes to Greece's debt.
Well, I'm not exactly sure how to respond to that other than to say that nothing has really changed, as you say, and it's now up to the European Union and the creditors of Greece to meet Greece halfway and get back to the table. Unfortunately, the vote was not a vote, was a vote on something that didn't really exist anymore on the table. It was a vote that was of June 25. So in essence, in my opinion, it was more of an emotional vote. It was a reactionary vote to the anti-austerity, to the anti-German policies of the European Union as have been perpetrated against Greece, this harsh austerity measures that has been placed now for the last 5 years and with no end in sight. So I think it was a reactionary vote. Having said that, I'm not sure everyone knew what the next day, and today is the next day, was going to bring, and we still don't know. It was interesting that, of course, today the Prime Minister asked the President of Greece to convene a meeting of all the top parties in Greece, and I believe 6 parties met today, but no decision has come out as to what exactly took place in that particular meeting.
Constance, I want to come to you. Can you look in your crystal ball? It's pretty unfair because we don't know what's going to happen. But what's your best sense? We've had an overwhelming landslide. We've had the finance minister resign and the leader of the opposition. What's going on here and what's the way forward?
So what we need to be paying more attention to is the IMF report that was released last week.
Good point.
The IMF admitted that Greece's debt is unsustainable. Even if Greece accepted the previous bailout package that is no longer on the table and it paid on time and did not default, it would still be in debt, 100% in debt of its GDP for even if it paid for 3 decades.
Because this hasn't worked, this austerity. We're in our 5th or 6th year, right? So what is the alternative? The IMF coming up with a new loan package, but could the European partners agree?
So the IMF is suggesting that Greece not make any payments for 20 years until growth is instilled. And it also suggested that it provide a haircut to Greece's debt.
James, in Athens, is that what people are pinning their hopes on, the IMF report, as one of the creditors, but also saying, look, what we've been doing is not working?
The IMF report certainly cut the ground completely from under the European creditors' position. What Greece needs is debt relief. It needs a relief from the austerity policies, and it needs to have as I said, the European Central Bank back in the business of providing the liquidity to make the economy function. If you got that, you got some private investment in, you got some public investment through the European Investment Bank, you would have some hope for recovery and eventual return to at least a modest level of prosperity. And that is probably the best you can hope for under these conditions.
Nick,
well, I agree with that, but I would like to ask Mr. Galbraith, though, in the sense of the literal letter of the law, Greece right now is insolvent. The banks are insolvent, and then under the characterization of the letter of the law, the ECB, technically under those terms, cannot give any more funding to Greece. I'll be curious to know if there's any wiggle room from our expert.
James?
My understanding is that there is. The Greek banks were not insolvent last week. What happened was that the Greek negotiations ended and the program expired, and the European Central Bank decided to cap, not to end, the emergency liquidity assistance. They could reverse that decision now that the referendum has occurred and negotiations are underway. And they could certainly, I should think, would be able to do so under the general power to provide basic financial stabilization. It would not take much if they just had a sense that the banks were not going to be shuttered, that deposits were not going to be haircut. Then people would return to normal pretty quickly. You put cash in the ATMs, they wouldn't necessarily rush to draw down their deposits as they were doing in advance of the referendum.
Constance, you see some wiggle room? Because look, literally at stake here is Greece's participation in the euro and also potentially the European Union. So this has to go well.
Yes, and in regards to the referendum, I'm not surprised that it was voted for a no.
Yes, you called it on our network last week. Actually.
I did, because with a country that has over 25% unemployment and young youth having an unemployment rate of over 50%, people need growth in the country.
Right, I just want to bring you, Nick, in again. You've met the current Prime Minister. You've talked to a lot of people over the last few weeks and years. Do you see them getting to some sort of deal with the creditors over the next week, or are we going to see this Grexit that we've now been talking about for years?
Well, first of all, I'm a very optimistic person when it comes to this, because I've gone on record as having said that Greece, through its 3,000 years of written history, not its unwritten history, has been through tremendous turmoil, invasion, occupation, civil war, civil unrest, you name it, it's been there, and it's been able to sustain itself for all these years. The building up there, the Parthenon that Mr. Galbraith has behind him is there as a testament to that. So it befuddles me how this generation of Greeks have not been able to come out of this, which is, in my opinion, compared to the other issues regarding history of Greece, minor in terms of the overall situation. So, in my opinion, failure isn't an option. Although you can claim they failed last week, failure isn't an option. And I spoke with the Greek Prime Minister, and the Greek Prime Minister told me on April 4th in a one-hour meeting that I had with him, and I'm quoting here, "We do not want to come out of the European Union. We do not want to come out of the euro. If we go back to the drachma, it will be an economic disaster, but we are being squeezed and we are being strangled by Europeans."
James, I want to go back to you in Athens for a word. The passions here have been very high. The German media have been portraying the Greek people as lazy sometimes, that they haven't got the reforms that they should do. Can we see a way out of this, considering Berlin's position and now Athens' position, backed by its own people?
Well, it is true that the German media have run a very vicious campaign, which, it has to be said, has not been reciprocated on the Greek side. There has been none of the same kind of vitriol directed back at the Germans, and of course there are many German tourists here, and they're not having any problems. So it really does become a matter that has to be resolved by Chancellor Merkel, by President Hollande. They have to bring their side to the table in an honest and forthright way. They have to, as I think was said earlier, to begin for the first time to meet the Greeks halfway on the questions of policy and especially on the questions of debt. If they're not willing to do that, if they're unable to control these forces that exploit anger, hatred, racism for that matter, in their own constituencies, then of course we're going to be in for a great deal of trouble.
And of course, that could be have a big effect on the euro and the eurozone. And that's what we're going to do after the break. Coming up, what happens if Greece leaves the eurozone? We'll continue our discussion on the fate of Greece. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.